Hi, my name is Julie Phoenix.
My name is Angela Davis-Fegan, and I'm an artist who lives and works in Chicago.
Hi, my name is Mel Tykonovich, and I'm a non-binary lesbian artist originally from St. Louis, Missouri. I received my Bachelor's of Fine Arts in Painting and Art History from the Kansas City Art Institute in 2017, and then I received my Master's of Fine Arts in Painting from the University of Miami in South Florida in 2021.
Here today to talk to you about one of my paintings called Self-Portrait, Owl Totem, which I painted in watercolor in 2019. The painting is 24 inches by 18 inches. And the painting was really, to me, an affirmation of my divinity and also my connection to nature. And not only my connection, but my relationship, I would say, to nature. One of the ways in which I feel that this painting is in dialogue with the theme of the calendar, which is revolutionary optimism, lesbian futures, has to do with the fact that for me, my artwork really is transformative. It is about my healing, both in terms of process, what I receive as I'm painting and doing my work, what I discover in doing my work, as I'm both thinking about what I'm painting, but also in terms of what I discover through the process of painting. And so, from that perspective, I think there's an optimism, there's a hopefulness in my work that I would say exists in every single piece that I do. I think this is a very revolutionary act, both being a African American lesbian artist, but also talking about self-love in particular and just love generally. And love for me is a very powerful, not only emotion, but for me, love is a verb, and it's about doing, and it's about beingness. And so for me, Self-Portrait Owl Totem really does encapsulate and exude this self-love and this love just overall or generally.
I do consider my work to be lesbian artwork. I'm someone whose identity cannot be separated from the artwork, with that whole death of the artist thing. I'm not someone who can make work that is not personal to me, and I don't want my work to be impersonal to me. So I am a lesbian, therefore I make lesbian artwork. My work in general, I work in mainly oils and explore representational themes of personal identity and gender politics. I'm going to talk a little bit about the piece that's included in the Sinister Wisdom calendar, which is called Study Number 2, in quotations, Charlie Skies. Charlie is the figure that is in the piece, and she was a good friend, is still a good friend and fellow graduate student at the University of Miami in South Florida. She's a printmaker. The piece itself came out of an idea of wanting to kind of splice together two different references. I am recently graduated, and my work has kind of been in transition for the last year and a half after graduating from grad school. And so I've been experimenting a lot with different references. Being a representational painter, my content in my work is always going to center around something recognizable, but being able to kind of abstract different references into one cohesive image is what I'm really interested in right now. So the piece started with this kind of traditional figure, and then it's kind of spliced together with this landscape representation, kind of abstracted landscape representation of a Midwestern sky. And a lot of it is intuitive. A lot of my work is intuitive in general. My color choices are often non-specific or intuitive as I continue with the piece. And that's a huge theme in my work too, is kind of the discovery of process. I'm not someone who has a definitive reason for making something when I first start a piece. It's more about the discovered meaning along the way. And yeah.
My piece behind me, Pilsen Window, has been included in Sinister Wisdom's upcoming 2023 calendar about revolutionary optimism and lesbian futures. And they have asked me to talk a little bit about my work and my process and how it relates to that theme. So I'm a letterpress printer and a painter, but I also make garments, and I'm speaking to you from my studio here in Bridgeport, which is again on the south side of Chicago. And I think it's very important to document and exalt and memorialize and attest to love in my life and queer relationships, and project them forward into the future by incorporating them as the subject matter for art. And I used to make a lot of just very political posters that were text-based, and use that as a community tool for gathering, and that was great when public space was a little bit less fraught, and pre-pandemic activating queer dance parties in Chicago, or Dyke March, or going to protests and being able to disseminate objects very quickly and give them to people and lend voice to their concerns was very gratifying. But turning inward and making a lot of like panel-based and more traditional studio artwork during the pandemic gave me time and space to focus on the private sphere and like my personal life. And so I documented a lot of my most recent past relationship through this process, and Pilsen Window is like the culmination of that body of work that I worked on for 2 years. And so I hope it brings joy, or at least documents a moment in time when I felt really happy. Like I said, I'm also a letterpress printer, so as you can see here, I have some standing type on the press. It's the form for the most recent abortion poster I printed for a dance party around Halloween. And then here's a survey wall, the different types of print ephemera of both my objects and my friends' work, just demonstrating what types of things get made in this kind of space. And then my painting is bouncing on top of our cabinets full of type. Here's some more print examples. And as you can see, it's the golden hour. So the light in here is usually pretty nice, even in November. So it's like a little studio tour. It's not super neat, but this is where our bindery is, and my little sewing station. There's some garments in progress, but I guess I'm a person who just feels compelled to make, and I like to incorporate all these different processes into the work. So here you can see a letterpress print that has been incorporated as a figure positive on this wood panel, which is covered in handmade paper. The handmade paper is all made from recycled denim, so that these processes that happen in this space kind of talk to each other. And so I'm really trying to incorporate as many mediums as I can. So even in the surface of Pilsen Window, there is many, many layers of handmade paper that make up the background before you get to the surface area or even the subject matter of the portrait itself. But it's all, again, about documenting a moment in time and using it as like a beacon of light to build towards an optimistic future.
I have a piece in the calendar titled Your Mom is a Dyke. A little about myself. I was born into a very strict Lutheran church and school. I was indoctrinated at a very young age. I knew exactly where lesbian women were going according to their God. And yeah, that indoctrination took hold pretty hard in my life, and I linked my worth to that faith that I had at the time. And by the time I was 19, I was married to a man. By the time I was 20, I had my first 3 kids. I stayed home with them and cared for them. As we know, living this way took a toll on my mental health. By the time I was in my early 30s, I was feeling like a terrible mother. I was feeling like a failure, and I was feeling suicidal. And I knew if I didn't step into my authenticity, that I was not going to survive. And so I made the best decision of my life, and I came out when my kids were 14, 10, and 8. And it was interesting to see how my role as a mother played into this new life that I had created for myself. For a long time, I held a lot of shame that I was a mom, that I wasn't lesbian enough because I didn't come out sooner. They were reminders of, a very hard time in my life where I was living in an unhealthy way for myself. I was embarrassed to say I was a mom to some members of our community, even because they would make assumptions about my sexuality, and that was triggering to me because after being so secretive for so long, I just really wanted people to see me how I saw myself, which was a lesbian. Over time, it's gotten easier. I've let go of some of the emotional baggage. I don't take things as personally, but I know I don't have to justify anything about being a mom, anything about being a lesbian. I know my experience, my life experience that I've had doesn't make me less of a dyke. So my kids are amazing humans. I love them so much. And when I made this piece, I was thinking about them in such a playful way.
I learned the basics of embroidery from my mother, who learned it from her mother. My style is more like drawing. I sketch a design on cloth, usually with chalk or markers, and then I use thread as paint to fill it in. I generally only use 2 or 3 actual stitches like chain and satin stitch with maybe a French knot or 2. They take much less time to complete. I think of myself as making the kind of art my mother and grandmother would have made if they'd had the time and opportunity. They were both tremendously creative women with many interests and passions, but these were always channeled into forms that made the most sense for their circumstances. My mother was also on the hook to support other people in their creative pursuits. As the sole income provider in a home with 2 children, no electricity, no running water, and an abusive partner who insisted she transcribe the handwritten pages of his never-published novel onto their early 90s floppy disk typewriter. When I think of revolutionary optimism, I think about the effort she went through to get me and my sister out of that house and to set both of us up to never settle for that kind of treatment from anyone. My mother was an early 2000s fag hag. She made friends at the annual Port Angeles Crossdressers Convention and took me and my closeted high school friends to Seattle Pride and the Fremont Solstice Parade and told their parents we went to the Pike Place Market. She had a copy of Judith Herman's Trauma and Recovery on her nightstand, and bookshelves full of prison and dissident literature, all centered around examining systems of power. She wanted us to know everything she needed to know when she was younger that would have saved her from some of the decisions that were coming her way, and largely she succeeded in teaching us that. This little oval St. Orifice took me over a year to complete, which is unusual for me as they normally take only a couple of months at most. I bought the canvas and the glitter paint with my employee discount at the craft store I was working at part-time, my first job since leaving an extremely homophobic office role over a year previously. I spent the first year of the pandemic unemployed. My partner didn't charge me rent, and I created over 40 embroidery pieces that first year alone. It was like I was on the flip side of my mother's experience. Now I was the jobless creative type living off my partner's generosity, only I wasn't doing cocaine and strangling her dogs. I worked, just not for a paycheck. I looked after the house and garden, and I worked on my art. I've made pieces both larger and more detailed than this one, but very few of them took as long as this did. Sometimes the image was too simple or too tacky or too silly for me to take it seriously. I couldn't make the body match the level of detail of the labia and the glittery void, and I kept putting on new details and picking them out, getting more and more frustrated as time went on. But then it came together and turned into what it wanted to be. Given time and space and the supportive environment that my mother and grandmother both lacked, I created something revolutionary in the context of my family's history. One of the last things my mother said to me before I stopped speaking to her was that she had created a monster in me, that she had sacrificed so much for someone who lacked the capacity for love and connection. She said this while very ill at the time, but I've always thought that in the context of her life, it's the only story she could tell about me that made sense to her. I'm one of those decade-spanning cross-stitches that once seemed so full of promise, only to turn out too ugly and out of alignment to be worth the effort. I finished the St. Orifice because it was worth it to me to finish them, and worth the effort it took to feel like I deserved to. And when I saw the call for artists at Sinister Wisdom, I wanted to submit them. I think they are beautiful and silly, and a little tacky, and very colorful. I think my mother would have cackled when she saw them, and that my grandmother would have been scandalized. I like thinking about what they would feel compelled to make in response. I have a relationship to them both in a way that does not remotely rely on present-day contact, which I think is the most optimistic and positive way for us all to do that. I'm very proud of all of our tremendously hard and revolutionary work.
Optimism is something that I really associate with lesbianism. The word lesbian is something that I've struggled for a long time to accept as my identity, and it's really only been the past couple of years that I felt really comfortable in being out. I've always accepted my love of women and women adjacent people, but I never, until recently, and probably a lot of people discovering their identity with the pandemic, I think feel the same, is the word lesbian never felt 100% like I wanted to commit to it. And that came from internalized homophobia and having the word used against me in the past, and not necessarily wanting to associate myself with something that I thought wasn't a good thing. But lesbianism is a good thing, and it's very optimistic for me, especially in the future. I see myself as more complete after accepting my lesbian identity, and it also plays into my gender. I feel like lesbianism is something that's very important to my gender expression and being gender nonconforming, and it's nice to know that the history of lesbianism and contemporary lesbianism is also inclusive of that.
I think including hope or optimism in both artwork and in political movements is a very important tool to make it all feel worth it, because both are tremendous amounts of labor and human coordination and problem solving and dealing with circumstance. So I'm inspired by the idea. I didn't make the piece knowing what the theme was in advance, but I hope that it does function as like a testament to a type of like lesbian romance that I'd like to see in the future, I guess, or at least remembered by history, which is all I can really hope for my art objects after I make them and they go out into the world.
Some of the symbolism in my work, I think, that also speaks to transformation has to do with the spirals that exist in a lot of my pieces. And the spirals for me essentially and culturally, more broadly speaking, represent change. And so it's very important for me to really be thinking about my work as a way to heal myself and also share, and it's sort of my gift, if you will, to the world. And I am in my work, whether I'm explicit or not, am an out lesbian. And for me, that has always been very important. Even in my 20s, I was painting and doing pictures of Audre Lorde and Angela Davis. I've given shout outs to Gloria Anzaldúa. I really do feel that it's important for us to acknowledge not only our history, to be in the present moment, but also to visualize, conceptualize, and imagine our futures. And for me, revolutionary optimism, lesbian futures, as a theme has provided me an opportunity to really think about my work in this particular context. So again, thank you so very, very much for including me.
You know, the queer community has always experienced revolution, and we still have a lot to do. But I am so optimistic about what I see and my queer siblings doing, our queer communities doing, our baby queers doing. It's just really exciting to see all the work that everyone is doing in our community. And I really do envision a future where all of our identities can kind of just mingle together within ourselves in a very healthy way, and we don't feel any type of shame or need to justify you know, who we are. So yeah, so here's to that. Here's to all of the late bloomer dykes who had kids before they came out. This piece is for my kids, but it's for your kids too.